school libraries. And we are really excited to bring you this webinar series along with our funding partners right there that you can see on the screen. The goals of the Media Landscape campaign really are to help Minnesota library staff understand our current and complicated media and information landscape, to learn how to navigate that landscape for our own selves, and then to gain strategies for helping our staff and our patrons and our students do so as well. All of this information about media landscapes can be found on levelupmn.org. That is our Minnesota Library Professional Development website. And on that website, you will find information. You'll find past speakers that we've had, recordings and discussion questions from those webinars. And this spring, we kicked off the campaign with Renee Hobbs, who talked about navigating a world full of propaganda. We had Lisa Hines talking to us about critical thinking and evaluating information. John McFreeman talked to us about deep fakes, and Michael Spikes talked to us about using news literacy to make sense of the current media landscape. So you'll find recordings of all of those webinars there on the site. And we have our lineup of our fall. We're getting that together. So right now we have registration that is open for 3 additional webinars. Next week, we will have Jamaica Anderson talking about civically engaging young adults through media literacy education. On October 14th, we have Rachel Whiteman, who will be talking about faith and fake news, helping churches address misinformation. And then in November, we have Penny Abernathy, who will be talking about uncovering truth in a news desert. So some really interesting topics. We also have our companion self-paced online curriculum called 23 Things that was developed by the Minnesota Multi-Type Library Systems. So you can, our aim is to get to 23 things. We have 9 things up on the website now that you can take a look at and get some CEUs for, so that's great. Yeah, so that is it. After today's webinar, I'll be sending out a follow-up email to all who registered with the recording of the webinar, an evaluation, and then instructions for how to request a CEU certificate if you would like one. So I think that's it. So let's go ahead and get started. I am so pleased to introduce Dave Hoggy and Kelly Smith, who are both journalists from the Star Tribune, who will be talking today about upholding journalism standards and ethics. So thank you so much for talking to us today, Dave and Kelly. I'm going to keep my eye on the chat. I know that you're going to be presenting for a while, and then probably we'll have some time for some question and answers after. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and it's all yours.
All right, Kelly, fire away.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having us. Yeah, so Dave and I, we both represent the Star Tribune. Dave as a longtime editor at the paper, and I'm a news reporter here. So we're here to talk about journalism standards and a little bit about news literacy. Although it sounds like you guys are all very well versed in that topic. So hopefully we'll be able to present some new information for you. When we talk to the public, we often talk about this phrase, the media, which again, since all of you have backgrounds in information literacy, this might be redundant, but we like to point out that, the media is a very monolithic term that doesn't mean a whole lot because it's encompassing of so many different mediums and forms of the media. And why this is important for today's discussion is that depending on what you're referencing or the public is referencing, different forms of the media have different ethical standards or even none at all. So for instance, some of the national news organizations, they will pay sources for high profile interviews. So if you see that really big interview that they have on the morning show, maybe they may have paid that source for that to do that interview. And the Star Tribune and other local newspapers, we never pay sources for interviews or any information at all. We want to remove that sort of conflict of interest. And likewise, the flip side of that is that we never get anything in exchange for our coverage. So I can't be paid by someone outside of the Star Tribune for my work. So this is a good example of this would be our restaurant critic, who reviews 200 to 300 restaurants each year. We pay for every one of those meals. We don't get a free meal in exchange for reviewing a restaurant. This is different if you follow travel blogs or Instagram influencers. There's no ethical standards guiding blogs or social media. And so if somebody posted a picture of the hotel they stayed at yesterday, they could have received that stay for free in exchange for posting about it. They don't necessarily have to disclose that, though they should. But at the Star Tribune, I've written a few travel articles, and I don't get anything for free in exchange for that travel story. So I paid for all my hotel stays or my restaurant visits or anything else associated with that travel story. And usually I don't disclose that I'm a reporter until after my visit, so I don't get any preferential treatment. So just want to differentiate that not all media have those same guidelines. Anything, Dave, I'm forgetting?
No, it's good. Good.
So hopefully most people know that TMZ and the Star Tribune have different ethical standards, but just to show one example of this, in 2016, when Prince died, TMZ was the first organization to report his death. And TMZ is notorious for being able to pay sources for information. They can say sources said, and then report what they're reporting. At the Star Tribune and other local newspapers, we can't just say sources said. We need to be able to cite our sources. So it took us a little bit of time. I think the very first story, maybe you remember, Dave, but it had maybe 2-3 sentences to it, just reporting that there was a death investigation at Paisley Park.
Mhm.
It took time to confirm details with law enforcement and other sources close to Prince before, at the end of the day, we had a fully fledged story, lots of coverage about his career and the death investigation. So, in the news industry, we talk about not always being first, but getting things right. So sometimes that takes time.
Kelly, the only thing I would add there is the competitive element, and everybody probably knows this, but we do try to be first. We try to be ahead of, Minnesota Public Radio or our other competitors. I remember the day that Prince died, and that news, the TMZ news, ran through our newsroom like an electric shock. I mean, dozens, scores of journalists were just shocked. And of course, our top editors said, how did someone else get that story first? We've got to get the story up on our website. And in this current digital era, to be 10 minutes late or 15 minutes late or 30 minutes late on a story of international significance in our hometown was really, really a tense matter. But as Kelly said, we can't rely on paid sources for a story like this. We can't rely on anonymous sources. And so everybody hustled very fast to catch up. And I think we did catch up in about 30 or 45 minutes and then updated the story throughout the day as we learned more.
Right. Yeah, so again, a lot of you may already know how the news industry works, but just to take you behind the scenes of our newsroom, and this would be the same really at any local newspaper in the US, and pretty similar processes for public radio or other local news organizations. So I'm one of about 40, 50 news reporters at the Star Tribune, and we're each assigned a specific beat to cover, and that's a topic area that we become sort of mini experts on. My current beat is nonprofits and philanthropy, but I've previously covered K-12 schools and Hennepin County government, politics, a little bit of everything. And so as beat reporters, we generally come up with our own story ideas. So that's either through sourcing. When I first started my beat, I met with 50 different nonprofit experts across the Twin Cities to try to understand the sector a little bit. And we also get a lot of press releases. And so we do the reporting, we write the story, turn it into our editor like Dave. who goes through and line edits it. And then it goes over to our copy desk where copy editors also go through and line edit it. They're gonna be fact checking key things like our names, all of our names spelled correctly. That's a key element that we want to fact check. We never want to spell anyone's name incorrectly. So they're gonna go through and fact check that. And they'll give us a call at 8 or 9 o'clock. Hey, we can't find any proof that this Kelly Smith exists. Are you sure that you spelled her name right? And so we'll, as reporters, have to go back, check our notes, make sure that we have our name spelled correctly, or take it out if we can't verify that. The page designers put the story on the pages, and the copy editors write the headlines and the captions. And then it heads off to our printing press in the North Loop, which also prints the Pioneer Press and regional copies of USA Today. And then obviously we have a whole team for our website and social media. We're constantly updating our website throughout the day. So if you log in at 9 a.m., the stories are probably different by noon. And stories, depending on if they're breaking news, can get re-updated throughout the day. The biggest example of this was our coverage of George Floyd the very first day that news broke. Our main police reporter, Labor Janney, that story was updated 115 times, 115. That's really extraordinary to have a story updated that many times throughout a day. So usually a story might get updated 2 or 3 times, depending on the breaking news that happens that day. Anything else to add, Dave? Oh, I think I lost it. Linda, is everything okay? Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Kelly. I think Dave just had some connection trouble, so I'll watch for him to enter back in.
Okay, sounds good. I'll keep forging ahead then.
Okay, thank you.
So now that you understand a little bit how our newsroom works, just talk a little bit about journalism ethics. So any local news organization pretty much in the US, it likely follows the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And there's a link there if you want to click through and read the full code of ethics there. Otherwise, it's at spj.org. And some of the main issues that it addresses is acting independently. So as we mentioned at the beginning, we have to avoid any conflict of interest. We can't accept any gifts in exchange for our coverage. I used to cover K-12 school board meetings that met at, I think, 7 a.m. and then 6 p.m. at night. So sometimes they'd have some bottle of water or a tray of cookies out for the public or something. And I wouldn't even take a bottle of water or a cookie because I didn't want the perception of me taking a bottle of water or cookie to affect people's perception of my objectivity covering that very agency. Our policy at the Star Tribune is that we can't accept anything of nominal value. So a bottle of water might actually be okay. But again, being very cautious that we don't accept anything for our coverage. The National Press Photographers Association also has a code of ethics. And so, one example of that, and you can click through if you want to see the full list of their code of ethics, is that, photos cannot be photoshopped or changed and altered in any way or staged. I cover nonprofits. So a lot of times when I'm covering, let's say a new nonprofit program in tomorrow's paper, I will do the interviews and then say, hey, could we take a photo of this new program? And they say, well, the program's not happening today. Can we just have some of our staff come together and make it look like the program is happening? And that might work for your internal marketing purposes or stuff like that, but it won't work in journalism. We can't stage something like that. It has to be happening organically, whether we're there or not. And that's the same for both as reporters or as photojournalists. The Star Tribune, we have a full policy online about our standards and policies. So I've mentioned a few of those already, but like I said, we have to maintain our independence. So we can't participate in any political events, protests, rallies. I can't put up a political yard sign in my yard or a bumper sticker on my car. We really avoid the use of anonymous sources. And if you read, national outlets like the New York Times or the Washington Post, you might see a little bit more use of anonymous sources on high profile stories like something related to the administration or the president or an overseas conflict. And in those cases, when people's life or job is at risk generally, then an anonymous source will be allowed. For the Star Tribune, we have to get approval from all of our top editors before we use any anonymous sources. And a common misconception from the public is that anonymous sources are anonymous to us. That's not true. We always know who the person's name is and their identity so that we can verify who they are and that they're a credible source. So in my career, in 10 years at the Star Tribune, I've only used maybe 2 anonymous sources. That could be partly from my own beats that I haven't generated those kind of stories that I need to rely on anonymous sources. But usually you can't tell the story any other way. And we do need to have layers of editors approve it. And we need to make sure that we have gotten multiple sources to confirm that information before we go with it. And of course, any errors that we report, we take really seriously. So we have to put up a correction, both in print. So it's on our second page of our paper every day. We list any corrections, and online we need to correct right away. And those are, unfortunately, they do happen, but we take them very seriously. And we try to go through and fact check each story as much as we can with our editor and our copy editors, to make sure that everything is factual and correct. And still, when the errors happen, I'm sure you can say, Dave, how it's heartbreaking whenever. No.
It's no fun.
Right. So we can't talk about ethics without talking about when journalists have breached some of these ethical guidelines. So in 2018, a longtime film critic of the Star Tribune was accused of plagiarism. The paper had investigated a decade's worth of his stories and found that there were some similar phrases used throughout that date back as far as 1974. So it wasn't something recently, but that he had lifted similar phrases. So there was the one example was comic strip craziness that someone else had used in a film review that he had also used. And he disputed the plagiarism allegation, saying that that was a fair use, but resigned shortly after that. And of course, there are lots of national examples of this happening, from NBC to the New York Times. In 2017, I wrote the story about a German journalist. He came to Fergus Falls to do a profile for the German magazine about Trump country after the election. And I'm not sure why they selected Fergus Falls, but they did, and wrote a story about, I think he was there for several weeks and interviewed many people. And the result of the story had things in it that the residents there in Fergus Falls said were inaccurate. So a sign at the city limits saying Mexicans keep out, they said that never existed. There were elements of some of the people that he quoted, like I think the city administrator having a gun, that were just inaccurate. And they had contacted the magazine saying these facts are inaccurate, please correct it. Couldn't get a hold of anyone. And I think about a year passed before we heard about it. So just a note that if you ever see anything like that happen from any journalist, to alert other journalists, because journalists want to uphold our standards and we want to make sure that we are holding other journalists accountable too. So I think in that situation, the reporter ended up resigning, and they ended up sending another reporter here to accurately report on Fergus Falls. Again, since all of you are, in the news or the information literacy world, this is probably pretty obvious to you, but when we talk to the public about how to verify information, if it's accurate or not, one example is if you come across a news site that you've never heard of, how do you verify if that is a credible news organization or not? Across Minnesota and across the country, there have been a lot of these websites popping up, like the St. Cloud Sun. And so it sounds like a local news organization. And if you had never heard of it, maybe you would think it is. So you would look into it and click probably the About section, as you guys all know, probably to do, and see who is behind it. Metric Media is what is listed. And if you did a quick search, you would find that there are some articles talking about how it's associated with the GOP and partisan site. I think the New York Times called it masquerading or mimicking local news. So that would obviously raise some red flags for me. I would also click on some of the articles and see if they have bylines, which some of them do. I would see that the person who is listed as the byline is not here in Minnesota, so that would raise some red flags. A lot of the articles that they have posted on there are press releases from local cities or are aggregating stories from local news organizations. So that would also raise some red flags for me. Whether that's legit, if you had never heard of MinPost and you came across that, again, I would look at the About, look to see, do they follow the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics? They list that specifically on their site. They talk about who their staff is. You can see bios on each of their staff. This is something that I think more and more news organizations are doing, are just trying to be a lot more transparent and include details about who each of their staff is, so that you can see if we're credible or not, where their money comes from. They have a corrections policy. So all those things that we talked about that the Star Tribune and other local newspapers do, they also do. So that would help you understand, if you've never seen MinPost before, that this is a credible news organization. And the News Literacy Project has a lot of great tips. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that organization already, but it's a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to news literacy. And so they just have a lot of great information that is helpful for people of all ages to review on how to vet information online. Dave, do you want to talk about the 7 standards of quality journalism?
Sure. Kelly, thanks. That's a great overview. And just to our audience, I want to say thank you for joining us today. I think accuracy and truth and facts, I think today matter more than they ever have, given the current political climate. And so journalists are extremely worried about this climate and concerned that readers know how to be smart consumers of the news and how to tell fact from fiction, whether it's in print or on the internet. So Kelly gave a great overview of sort of guidelines and standards that we use. What I'd like to do is walk you through an actual case study involving a story that we published in the Star Tribune a few years ago, kind of a red hot controversial story, and go step by step how we applied our own standards, which happen to follow the ones on the screen quite closely. These are from the News Literacy Project, which I'll talk about at the end of this. And I want to be honest, if you walked into a newsroom today, you wouldn't see this checklist posted above every reporter's desk and every editor's desk. Different news organizations have different standards, but I was in journalism for 40 years, and I would say every credible news organization where I've ever worked or that I know of follows something like this. And if my reporters weren't following a checklist like this, I would have to catch it. If I didn't catch it, I would be in trouble with my boss. If she didn't catch it, she would be in trouble with her boss. And, we make mistakes all the time, but I would say most credible, serious news organizations use something like this. So my story begins a few years ago. I had a terrific reporter on my team, Paul McEnroe, one of the great investigative reporters in Minnesota journalism history. Paul had covered criminal justice in Minnesota for several years. He had a great network of sources in the court system, law enforcement, Department of Corrections. And he came over to my desk one day and he said, "You're not going to believe what I just found out." He had had a phone call from a source in the State Department of Corrections, prison system, saying that there was an inmate in one of the state prisons who was infected with leprosy. And he had passed his medical exam on intake into the prison system. They didn't catch the leprosy. He had been circulating in the general prison population for several weeks. Now, if you're like me, you associate leprosy with a lot of scary things. Most of us think back to the Middle Ages when leprosy was a terrifying, highly infectious disease. People with leprosy were sent to what were called leper colonies. People were terrified of leprosy. It was a terminal and highly infectious disease. So we were, pretty shocked. But at this stage of the game, all we had was one tip from a good source within the Department of Corrections, but she was off the record, and we can't go with a story like that. So I asked Paul to hit the phones again and see if he could confirm it with other sources. So guideline number one, multiple credible sources. The next day, Paul spent all day on the phone, reached 3 additional sources inside the Department of Corrections who independently confirmed the tip. They didn't work with, they weren't friends with his first source, independent sources. They all confirmed the basic facts of the story: who the inmate was, when he entered the prison system, and that he was infected with leprosy. They hadn't caught it. So at this stage, we felt, okay, we're pretty sure we have a story that's worth spending our time on and spend more time and pursue it. But a story, as Kelly said, we seldom, almost never publish stories in the Star Tribune with anonymous sources. None of our sources would go on the record. So what we typically do then is there a document we can get that confirms this and gives us documentary factual proof? Second day, Paul went back on the phone. And by the end of the day, one of his sources had sent him an email chain from inside the Department of Corrections. We were able to confirm that it was a legitimate email chain, Department of Corrections, an email chain that included several officials in the prison system who, again, confirmed the basic facts that Paul had been told. There was an inmate moving around in the general population, infected with leprosy. They'd missed it on his medical intake. And several officials within the Department of Corrections knew of this. Now we knew we had a story that we could publish. It was serious. We'd confirmed it with multiple sources and with documentary verification. So the next thing was sort of, I'm going to combine fairness and avoidance of bias. And this is a difficult stage of the story because Paul, a great reporter, he was not a fan of the Commissioner of Corrections at that time, who was a controversial political appointee. And I knew that several of Paul's sources also were not big fans of the commissioner. And they weren't above, giving us tips and story ideas that cast the commissioner in a bad light. So I thought we got to deepen our reporting a little bit. And so the first thing we wanted to do was, okay, really, how bad is this? And I asked Paul to get back on the phone to ask some additional questions. How sick is this inmate? Has anyone else in the prison system become infected with leprosy? Has anybody died? Is this one case or is this really, really bad? And the second thing was to see if we could broaden our reporting. As it happens, Paul also knew the deputy commissioner in the Department of Corrections, an old source of his. She was also a political appointee. She was loyal to the commissioner, and she was going to defend him. Paul got her on the phone and she confirmed that the story was true. She said, it makes our agency look really bad. She wouldn't go on the record, but she confirmed that it was true. So now we had this story from a variety of sources with different points of view. So at this stage, we knew we had a great story. We knew it was true. We knew it was controversial. It was time to, reach the balance stage. And at this point, Paul called the commissioner's office. You don't want to call a high official, the governor or a cabinet commissioner, with what could be just a ridiculous story. By this point, we knew we had a good story. Called the commissioner's office to see if we could get an actual on-the-record interview with someone in a position of authority in the department. Paul got an interview with the chief medical officer on the record, stand-up guy, very good. He said, yeah, it's absolutely true. We're chagrined. You caught us flat-footed. Here are the steps that we are taking to address this case of leprosy and prevent it from happening again. Now we had the story proved. We had sort of some balance and some fairness in it. We had an official response from the commission. Let me add one other thing about balance and why you call, as it were, the target of a story like this. We do it for fairness. We want to let, in this case, the commissioner and his staff, we want to let them know that this story was going to be in the paper in a day or two. You don't want to blindside somebody with this. It's not fair. And we wanted to get their side of the story. I mean, obvious balance and fairness, but also, sometimes you make a phone call like this and you learn some things that we didn't already know. For all we knew, the Department of Corrections had already changed its medical policies, had already changed the staff conducting medical exams. And so often these sort of fairness balance interviews, really add a lot to the story. In this case, it didn't. We already had the facts and the medical officer confirmed it. Final step before we published the story, Paul was ready to go. Man, he's a great, great reporter. Final step was context. I realized at this point that all of our sources were within the prison system. They were corrections officials. They're familiar with law enforcement and corrections. And we didn't have any medical experts. We were talking about, a really scary disease. And I thought we needed some medical context. I asked Paul to make some more phone calls, University of Minnesota Medical School, Mayo Clinic, just so that we could educate ourselves and our readers a little bit more about leprosy. Paul reached an infectious disease specialist at Mayo who knew a lot about leprosy. And this is the point where our hearts sort of sank because we thought we had a red hot story. And she said, well, you know what? We no longer consider leprosy as scary as they did, in the 14th century. It turns out that leprosy is a little less infectious than we used to think, that it's pretty easily treated with medications. And it's probably unlikely that anybody else in the prison system caught leprosy from this inmate unless there was very close contact. But she added, and the really important point, she said, it's just shocking. It was just shocking that an inmate could be admitted into the Minnesota prison system and have a medical exam and that they never caught it. She said there was a sign of really shoddy medical care. And this was significant to us because Paul had already written a few stories that year about inferior medical care in the state prison system. Minnesota had subcontracted medical care to a private for-profit medical provider. There have been several instances of substandard medical care. And this was a really, really bad example of that. And so, Kelly, if you can go to the next slide, here's the story that we published that Sunday, which if you read it at your leisure, I think you'll find most of these elements. I'm going to wrap it up there and turn it over to questions. There we go. Leper was kept with other state prisoners. Gives you the background on the inmate. Quotes the commissioner, quotes the medical expert from Mayo. And we tried to make this larger point. This isn't just one individual, the sad case of leprosy, shocking instance. It was a bigger story because it was one more signifier of inferior medical care, which is not acceptable under case law in Minnesota and in the United States, inferior medical care for people in the prison system.
I just have a couple of other examples just quickly of ways that our ethics. Linda, do you want to add something?
Yeah, we did have a question in the chat. Pamela is asking, what about HIPAA protecting the rights of the inmate, Dave?
Right. In that case, we got a waiver from the inmate, to use his name. And so that's the way we got it. I would add something about HIPAA, though. I supervised medical coverage for 10 years. And to tell you the truth, I was educated by my reporters, Josephine Marcotti, Maura Lerner, brilliant, experienced medical writers. And they said, this is worth bearing in mind, they said that a lot of institutions and organizations will hide behind HIPAA. We just had an example where a member of Congress said, I'm not going to tell you whether I've had the COVID vaccine, I'm protected by HIPAA. Well, that's often used as a smokescreen. It's true that hospitals and medical providers have to honor the privacy provisions of HIPAA, but people often hide behind it because they don't want to give you information, which they do have to. I just want to make one point in closing. I mean, to be really clear about this, we were proud of this story. We felt that we followed the right standards of quality journalism, but I don't want Kelly and me to leave anyone in the audience with the impression that we think we're perfect, or that we think because we follow these standards, we somehow walk on water, because we sure don't. We make mistakes all the time. We get things wrong, from misspelling names to really big issues. And the point is that we try to be accountable to the public when we do get something wrong. And it's happened to me a lot. When I was an editor supervising health and environmental coverage, if we were working on something controversial, I always made sure that our sources had my phone number and my email, as well as that of the reporter. If somebody was mad about a story and couldn't get satisfaction from the reporter, they could call me. And I will tell you, I took a lot of difficult phone calls, difficult conversations, and always said, look to the source. If you're not satisfied with the way we've handled a story, after talking to the reporter, after talking to me, here's the phone number for the managing editor. She will take your call, and the editor, Renee Sanchez, above her, and please take your complaints to them. And so I think the point is not that anybody is perfect or anybody always gets things right, but that they are accountable to readers and the public, and they're transparent about their work. I gave a talk a year or two ago where someone in the audience at the end said, well, give us some examples of news organizations that are reliable? How can we find somebody where we know it's the truth, or where we know it's quality journalism? And, I could have said, well, New York Times, Washington Post, National Public Radio, CBS, these Wall Street Journal, these highly respected, MinnPost, highly respected news organizations. But I didn't want to do that because, everybody says, well, they're biased or people have their own choices. Rather than name news organizations, and this is a point that I would leave you with, you are librarians and information specialists, and I know you'll appreciate this. I think it's best to use criteria. Not say, well, gee whiz, the New York Times is always right, or the Fox News is always right, but to use the criteria of accountability. Kelly touched on some of these, and I would really recommend, if you're interested in this stuff and want to pursue it further, go to that website of the News Literacy Project. It's a nonprofit. It's run by outstanding journalists. It's not political. Their website is newslit.org. And they have a tremendous, it's just fun to play around on their website. They have a tremendous set of tools and materials, something called Checkology, how to vet a news story. They have, I think Myth of the Week, a little blog or a news feed where they'll go into some extremely hot controversial story of the week and how it was reported out for better and for worse. And it has this list of quality standards that we just mentioned. So if you want to pursue that question of how to separate the wheat from the chaff, I really recommend newslit.org. All right, I'll wrap it up there. Happy to take questions, or Kelly, if you have additional stuff, or Linda, if you
Yeah, I'll just show just two quick other examples of how we use our ethics every day. So like I said, we have to disclose any conflicts of interest. This happens a lot in our sports section because we'll cover the Timberwolves and the Lynx, which share the same owner as the Star Tribune, Glenn Taylor. So anytime we quote him, we need to disclose that he also owns the Star Tribune so that our readers know that conflict of interest exists. If I was married to a Minneapolis teacher, I shouldn't be covering Minneapolis K-12 education. I would need to disclose that to my editors, and they would likely assign that story to someone else. Like I said, very rarely do we use anonymous sources and Dave already gave a great example of how if we do use anonymous sources, we need to state why we're using them, and we need to have multiple sources within that story. So police reports, court documents. Can we get people who will go on the record with their name, like attorneys or other people who, in this story situation, other people who would use their name to confirm details about these sexual misconducts that were reported. So we try to have layers of sourcings to back up any claims like that. And then just finally, this may be pretty obvious to a lot of you, but the public, I would say, vastly misunderstands our opinion section, which is completely separate and independent from our newsroom. So this is something specific to newspapers, not public radio or TV news. We have this separate op-ed section, and the people pictured there are a part of our editorial board. So they're the ones who write the editorials, which might take a stance on a news story that I or another reporter has written. We don't know about it until we open up the paper the next day and see that they've written an editorial about it. So any columns, opinion columns, or letters to the editor that might criticize my reporting, I won't know about it until I see the paper, just like you guys as readers. And we also have opinion columnists throughout the paper in our sports, business, features, and news sections. They're designated by their headshot in the paper, and they can give first-person analysis and their opinions, which I can't do as a reporter. And then just finally, that we also have a separate advertising department that is completely separate from the newsroom. Likewise, I have no idea what the advertisements are in the paper until I see the paper as well. And I know a lot of students get confused by the sponsored content phrase. That's just a euphemism for paid advertisements. So if you see that online or in print, just know that that is a paid ad. And with that, we will take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly and Dave. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put in the chat and I will read those. As we wait for some questions to come in, I guess I'm really wondering, you know, Dave, you talked about the importance of kind of trying to get both sides or all sides of a story. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of doing that when maybe one or more of the sides seems like it doesn't have much evidence or is so kind of out there? Like, how do you handle that?
Right. Well, Linda, it's a great question. And, you know, it's one that's become more fraught and more difficult in the last 4 or 5 years. I don't want to get political and take sides here, but I think the nature of politics, certainly at the national level, has changed a lot. Some years ago, I spent some time working for a US senator. And I will tell you that if we got the tiniest thing wrong in a press release or in a statement, the tiniest fact wrong, she would have our heads because she was embarrassed that she had been caught saying that something wasn't true. And for years and years and years, news organizations relied on that. If they called the governor, if they called the mayor, if they called the woman who's running an important nonprofit, and quote them in the newspaper on the record by name, most of the time, not all the time, but it was a fairly good rule that you could count on. They weren't going to, they might get something wrong, they might stretch it, they might bend the truth a bit, but they weren't going to feed you blatant lies. And so that was a reasonably good, not perfect, but a reasonably good way of achieving balance and making a story more comprehensive. These days, I'm afraid that's, you know, we've lost that. And what you've seen to that effect is this huge debate especially in the national news organizations. Many of you have probably followed this in the New York Times or the Washington Post, with whether they're willing to use the word lie. And for a long, long time, news organizations just weren't willing to do that, especially about the president of the United States. And again, I don't want to get into particular politics and so on, but you would find news organizations going out of their way to try to let the reader know, we don't think this is true. We think this is misleading. We don't think this is supported by the facts. But they didn't want to use the word lie and say, well, in a contested statement or in a statement that seems inconsistent with the facts. And news organizations really, really struggled with it. And I think you have seen those standards shift a bit. I think the New York Times finally used the word lie in a headline, a year ago or so. And so the verification landscape, has changed dramatically. Most of the big news organizations now have this little item that's called the fact checker. And I think they've come to realize that if some important person gives a speech, it's not responsible to publish that speech or broadcast that speech without fact checking it as you go along. They did it with Trump, they're doing it with Biden now. Also imperfect, because a lot of readers are going to find fault in the fact checking, or they're not going to believe the fact checking. But it has gotten much, much more difficult. I would add one other thing that I think is good. In the internet era, it's really hurt newspapers. It's killed our advertising. It's taken our audiences away. Newspapers have been closing like crazy and laying off reporters like crazy. But in the internet era, readers can do that for themselves. If they don't believe something in the Star Tribune, they don't believe something in the New York Times, Fox News, it's quite easy these days to go online and verify it for themselves, which I think is terrific, and it's good for journalists. It keeps us on our toes to know that if somebody doesn't like my story, they can go to the website of the Congressional Budget Office and they'll say, well, Dave got the numbers all wrong. So that's good. Kelly, do you want to add anything on that?
No, just to that point, I would say, and again, as librarians, you probably know this, but always get multiple sources. So you should be reading the Star Tribune. You shouldn't just be listening to NPR. You should be getting news from multiple news organizations.
Yeah, and that kind of goes, there are a couple comments in the chat. So Pamela says Gary Schweitzer's website healthnewsreview.org is no longer funded, but provided analysis of health news, whether it was accurate or not. Seems like we need a site like this. And then Ruth says, what are the best news sources that cover news sources? So I like that phrase, verification landscape.
Yeah, let me take the first one because I knew Gary Schweitzer really, really well. When I took over as health editor 10, 11 years ago, Gary was at the U and he was running this terrific website. I will tell you that Gary and I had some pretty heated arguments because he challenged the work of a couple of my reporters in ways that I thought were wrong and in fact were misleading. And my reporters were better and more sophisticated in some ways than Gary was. Now, that said, Gary published a fantastic set of criteria that medical reporters should follow. And I printed out several copies of that, and we did keep that taped above our desks. It was just extremely useful because there's a lot of bad medical reporting out there that hypes a new cancer breakthrough or hypes a scary new illness. And we used Gary's material a lot in vetting our own stories before publication. The second question, I'm not so sure. Kelly, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so they're looking for news sources that cover the media, the news organizations, right?
Right.
Pointer is really great. So these are just, sites that cover trends and news within the news industry. Neiman Lab covers a lot about the news news outlets. So talking about the challenges that we're facing, the ethical dilemmas we're debating. Yeah, those would be. Oh, thanks for sharing it. I didn't share it to everyone. Thank you. Yeah, so those are just two sites that cover news organizations. One thing to note is that there used to be a lot of media critics and media writers here in the Twin Cities. MidPost had one, so they would write, about the Star Tribune, and maybe it wasn't news that we wanted people to know about us, but that was out there. And now there's fewer and fewer of those people just nationally covering media, which is a shame because we should be held accountable too.
Great, thank you. You talked about, newspapers are kind of, oh, quick question, is Gary Schweitzer's guidelines still available elsewhere, Dave? Did you know?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. It's 6 or 7 years since I talked to Gary, and I think as the previous chat person noted, I think his institute at the U is no longer funded. I'm guessing that if you Googled, and in a minute I'll do this, if you Googled Gary Schweitzer or the Health News Review, you might still find, an older web page that would have his material.
Okay, and yeah, Pamela says, I think they still are
Yep,
on the
still on the
website.
website. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Pamela. I guess I was just wondering, how, you talked about kind of the decline of the newspaper. How can we keep it alive, build trust in news? Maybe just what do you see the future holding for newspaper journalism?
Right. The simple answer that I would give, and it's the obvious answer, is subscribe to a local newspaper or a national newspaper. A whole generation in the internet era grew up with the idea that everything is free, right? Music is free, news is free. Well, I'm a big jazz fan, and I will tell you, music is not free, right? Musicians have to pay the rent. Musicians have to buy groceries. Musicians have to pay for lessons and fix their instruments. And it's the same thing with news. Here's a tiny little example. Some years ago, when the Iraq War was still going, I heard a wonderful talk by the managing editor of the New York Times, and she said, it cost the New York Times $1 million a year just for their Baghdad bureau. For one overseas bureau, $1 million a year. So news is not free. The Star Tribune, I'll bet it spends $500,000 a year to keep a bureau at the state capitol to cover the legislature, 2-3 reporters, rent, internet, et cetera. So news is not free, and news organizations need the support. In the old days, when I started as a pup years ago, newspapers stood on what we called a three-legged stool. Revenues were one-third, one-third, one-third. One-third was classified ads. Remember the big Sunday papers? We used to get packed with want ads. Craigslist, all that stuff is gone. Want ads have essentially, so 1/3 of the overall revenues of most newspapers disappeared overnight. So you could cut staff by 1/3. The other was display ads, the big ads for Northwest Airlines or Dayton's. That was the other third. And most of those have gone because now there's targeted advertising. If Northwest Delta Airlines wants to sell you an airplane ticket, they do it online because they know that you just flew to Atlanta. And so the final third was subscribers. So in the old days, if you paid $1 for the newspaper, you were getting a $3 newspaper. You were paying $1 and it was a $3. And so as a result, news organizations are asking subscribers to pay more. Now, newspapers are expensive. My wife and I, we get the Sunday New York Times at home. It's $700 a year. It's really expensive. And I'm realistic about this. A lot of people can't afford it. It's not worth it. They have other things that are higher priority, spend their money. These digital subscriptions these days are so cheap. You get the Washington Post for $9 a month, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what a digital subscription to the Star Tribune is because we still get that at home. So I would say subscribe, but also hold them accountable. If you see something in the Star Tribune that you know is wrong or you think has the wrong, call and complain. Call the reporter, call their editor, let them know that you think the coverage is substandard, and it'll be good for everybody.
Yeah, I would just echo what Dave said, to support your local news organizations, whatever that might be, whether it's local radio, online news, or newspapers. Just in Minnesota in the pandemic, we've lost 8 local newspapers. And I know you have a whole session on news deserts, so I don't want to be redundant, but there is a huge threat of growing news deserts across the US and here in Minnesota. And the only way to stop that is to support your local news organizations. So there's a whole ecosystem of journalists. And so when the when Greater Minnesota loses newspapers and news outlets, those, we at the Star Tribune read those papers so that we know what's happening in Greater Minnesota too, because we can't possibly cover each of those communities at the same level. So it affects the entire ecosystem. The New York Times is reading the Star Tribune and know what's going on in Minnesota. And so when we lose staffing or lose news organizations, newspapers particularly, then it affects the entire ecosystem.
There are also some little nonprofits that are starting to spring up now. I'll tell you about one I just heard about, which is just outstanding. I don't know if we have anybody on the call who's from Iowa, but in northwestern Iowa, there's a fantastic, rather new biweekly newspaper in Storm Lake, Iowa, called the Storm Lake Times. Two brothers, John and Art Cullen. They're both from Storm Lake. Art came up to University St. Thomas and got a graduate degree, worked briefly at the Tribune, and is now editor of the Storm Lake Times. And they are just ferocious and fearless and excellent. And I'll tell you how good they are. They're so good that Art Cullen won a Pulitzer Prize. This tiny, tiny little newspaper in Storm Lake, Iowa. He won the highest national honor in journalism 4 or 5 years ago. And I just talked with Art the other day. I'm a big fan of the guy and their work. And they've started a foundation to support small town papers in Western Iowa. It's the Western Iowa Journalism Foundation. And, they're raising money to support those small town papers. And it's a brilliant idea, and they're doing outstanding work.
Great, thank you. Another question from Anne. How does the Star Tribune moderate or respond to reader comments online?
Kelly, you are probably more up to date on that than I am.
Yeah, so from what I understand, and again, this isn't my expertise because I'm a reporter, so I have nothing to do with this, but I believe we contract with folks to moderate those comments, and they have to follow our policies, which I believe are listed online, and can't attack people or, it can't be inappropriate. A lot of our stories, particularly stories involving crime or race, I'm trying to think of other topics, but those two come to mind. We don't allow any comments on because they often devolve to inappropriate comments. I personally don't read my comments on my stories most days. So hopefully, again, if you have an issue with the story, hopefully you reach out directly to the reporter. My phone number and email is on every story, so I'm willing and available to take any criticism or thoughts directly.
Since we're talking ethics, I want to venture onto thin ice here. I'm deeply troubled by the online comments that we get at the Star Tribune. I think they're often deeply ignorant. I think they're often mean. I think those comments conversations often deteriorate into uninformed and vicious conversations. And we had conversations about whether we should just turn that off or apply the standards. If you think about the editorial page of a newspaper, if you want to comment on a story, write a letter to the editor, you have to sign it. You have to put your name on it, and you have to have an address. And I worked on the editorial page for 10 years. We would confirm every letter that we were going to publish. We would check that address, make sure it was a real person, and they had to put their name on it. And we had conversations like that in the newsroom. If people are going to comment online, shouldn't they have to put their name on it? And there was pushback against that, frankly, because one way of encouraging online readership and keeping readers engaged online, which makes money, is to have those online comments, and people really enjoy it. So it's not an easy. We reached a point where I asked my reporters to stop reading the comments on their stories. Reporters want to read those because they want to know what are the readers thinking. They want to stay informed. They want feedback from readers. I reached a point where I said, just stop reading the comments, because it's not that they're uninformed or not helpful. They're actually destructive to the work that we do in some cases.
Yeah, and so she agrees, but it does give you a view into what some of your neighbors think, for good or bad, I guess.
Yep.
All right. Well, we are at 4 o'clock. Unless there is anything else, any other questions? I don't see anything else coming in.
I would just say, if anyone does have any questions later at any point, or if you want to invite a local journalist to your library to speak or anything like that, know that local journalists are very accessible. We want to talk more about how journalism works and try to demystify the process. So you can contact really any local journalist and they'd probably be willing to speak or answer any questions you have. And Dave and I, for sure.
Kelly has organized a wonderful speakers bureau through our union, the Newspaper Guild, Newsroom Colleagues. It's a terrific speakers bureau. We love going out. Even if we get yelled at, it's good. If we get challenged, as we have here today, it's really, really good. And we love it.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kelly and Dave. We really appreciate you joining us. And yeah, if you want to get in touch with them, I think their contact information is on the website. I'm going to go ahead and paste that levelupmn.org in the chat. And that has their information and also the upcoming speakers that we have. So again, thank you so much, Kelly and Dave. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you later.
Thank you. It's been a real privilege. Thank you.
Thanks.